Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my October wrap-up. October was an interesting month. I did some good reading. I read 8 books this month, but it was a little bit difficult, I guess. If you follow me on Twitter, you may see that I, for some reason, just got absolutely slammed with migraines for a few days in October, which really impacted my reading. It happens to be a particularly stressful time at work because I work in academic publishing, and basically all of the stuff that we need to get out for the end of the year, to publish for the end of the year, needs to be done now and in the next month, so November will be interesting too. And just a lot of stuff seems to have kind of shaken up my reading a little bit. So what you'll see here is, well, there is some like fantasy in here. A lot of this is not necessarily stuff that you would normally see in one of my wrap-ups, which do tend to lean very heavily towards sci-fi and fantasy. I read a fair bit of horror this month. I read a dystopian book, and I read some good classic stuff. So I am going to go ahead and dive right in. If you are interested in seeing what November and December, possibly parts of January, are going to be like for me, you can go ahead and check out my incredibly chaotic TBR. I'm going into lockdown with my parents, my mom and dad, who have a house as opposed to this flat that we live in. We're bringing the cats, and I am bringing a lot of books to see me through it. I'm basically figure that I will be like in a confined space essentially and not able to leave and like buy more books and, you know, get distracted by more books. So I just kind of like went mad and pulled a bunch of stuff off of my shelves, and that's the stuff I'm gonna read. So if you want to see what my chaotic TBR looks like, you can go ahead and check that out above. But without any further ado, let's get into the books I read this month. So the very first book that I read this month was a horror book, and it was one that I really enjoyed. I guess I keep saying that I am sort of like, you know, sticking my toe into the horror genre, testing the waters, but I feel like I've been doing that for long enough now that I can say I do read a bit of horror. But this was one of my favorite ones that I have read so far, and this is an author that I have read fantasy stuff from in the past. So this was The Ghost Tree by Christina Henry. This came out from Titan Books, I believe, at the end of September, so this is available now if it's something that you are interested in. And if you're interested in things like Stranger Things, then I would definitely recommend this one, because this is a 1980s set horror novel that takes place in a small town. So this book follows a girl named Lauren, and her life is undergoing a lot of changes at the moment. So she's about 14, and so of course, like, she and her childhood best friend are starting to sort of like diverge in terms of what they're interested in. Her friend is more interested in boys and makeup and things like that, and Lauren just kind of wants to cling on to her childhood that little bit longer before they go into high school as freshmen. And the year before, Lauren's dad was actually killed in a very mysterious and strange way. He was murdered, and she and her family are kind of recovering from that. So at the beginning of this story, everything is kind of normal-ish, and then Lauren and her little brother start to have these kinds of strange experiences. So her little brother seems to know things that are happening before they happen, and Lauren has these kinds of visions in the woods of a horrible monster who is killing young girls. And of course, the remains of 2 young girls are found in her neighborhood, and she has to try to figure out what's going on. So this is very much like a good, solid horror story. I really enjoyed this, and it also has a lot of the coming of age elements that I do particularly enjoy. Although this does seem kind of like a YA type book. I don't think I would classify this as YA, although I do think it has a lot of crossover appeal if anyone is looking for a good YA horror book. Just as a little bit of a heads up for content warnings, we have like some gore and gross stuff like that you would expect to see in a horror book. book where there is something going around and tearing people apart, quite literally. But there is some really, really intense racism in this book. One of the point of view characters outside of Lauren is a police officer whose family is new in town from Chicago, and they are a Hispanic family, and their neighbor, sort of Lauren and his family's neighbor, is a horrible, nasty, bigoted white woman. And that kind of racism begins to build and build and build as, you know, stuff happens in this book. So just as a heads up, if that's something that you're uncomfortable with, kind of like the mobs and the racism and stuff like that, this might be one to miss. But I do think that this is a really, really fabulous book. It was a really interesting read, and I really like the fact that although we do tend to focus very heavily on Lauren, we have other point of view characters that bring a lot into the story. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I thought this was really, really fabulous. This is a really great one to read in the fall. The next book that I read is an interesting one. So this is one that I buddy read with my friend Amber from Books of Amber. It's one that both of us have had on our TBRs for a little while, and I think we both felt fairly similar about this book. It's one that I have very mixed feelings about. So this is The Luminous Dead by Caitlin Starling. This is basically a sci-fi thriller, and based on the cover and based on the back of the book and everything like that, I think that maybe I had slightly different expectations as to what this would be. I expected this to have more horror elements in it, which it didn't really. It had a few. But this is really about isolation and a character kind of descending into madness. And it was quite fun in a lot of places, but I do think it had some ups and downs. So this book follows a character named Gear, and she has essentially faked her credentials to get into this cave diving mission. And the reason that she did this is because cave diving is incredibly well paid in this particular world, because it is so incredibly dangerous. So one job or two, if you survive, you're basically set for life, and she wants to get off planet and she wants to find her mother, who abandoned her and her father when she was younger. So this follows just her point of view, and she's basically in the caves for the entire book, and the only communication with the outside world is her handler, whose name is M. And M is a very strange person. So where there should be an entire team of people handling a diver's status and everything like that, handling the mission, it's just M, who is not sleeping, who has this very intense need for control, who's just not what Gear had expected. And so the two of them have to kind of learn to trust each other and to bond with each other as Gear is going further and further into these caves and fulfilling this particular mission, which may not necessarily be what it seems. So things that I liked about this book, I thought that the setting was really interesting. I thought that the caves, while they could have been incredibly boring because there's not a lot going on in a cave, I think that she did a really good job of adding kind of elements that made things more difficult or sort of changed things up, shook things up. I really enjoyed a lot of the sort of cave diving elements of this, although I do think that we spent a lot of time just rappelling down, you know, cliffs and setting up camps and stuff like that. I feel like a little bit more could have been added to the story in that sense, but it was interesting to see the technical side of this. I have a feeling that this is one of those books where the author did a lot of research into the subject and was like, I did so much research, I am going to put as much as possible into this, and that's sort of how we ended up in this particular very, very technical book. I enjoyed lots of the various bits. There are some horror elements, as I said, and I really liked the fact that it went from kind of normal, then bam, horror thing happens, and it's so sudden. It's almost like a jump scare in a book, and I thought it was really effective and really well done. What I didn't love so much was Gear as a character. I think that their reactions to things just felt so incredibly over the top and kind of unnecessary. I could understand if they had those reactions later on as things were getting kind of weirder and weirder, but immediately I think she's just so incredibly high-strung that I thought we were going in a completely different direction with where this book was going to kind of go, and it just felt weird. It felt like she had such weird reactions to things, and the way that she processed information from M was very strange. And to be fair, M's not really a character that you kind of can trust, but it just felt so incredibly over the top. It just didn't feel like it worked. It didn't feel like it fit with the story. If you're looking for a sci-fi thriller, I would say you should definitely give this one a try. It's an interesting one. It's a weird one. I can definitely see how this would absolutely like work so perfectly for some readers and then just not for others. For me, this was a 3-star read. It was fine and I enjoyed it. I finished it. I tend to not, finish books that I'm not liking, but I felt like it could have been a lot more. Then I picked up The Phlebotomist by Chris Panettiere. This is a really interesting one because it is a dystopian novel. However, I feel like it went in a lot of directions that I've not seen from dystopian before, which was really, really fun. So basically, this book follows a character named Willa, and Willa is a phlebotomist. She is someone who draws blood. And in this particular society, there was a huge sort of nuclear war, and so blood is desperately needed to help save people's lives, especially in these fallout zones. So society has kind of evolved to be placed into hierarchies based on blood type. So at the very top you have, I think O negative is the universal donor. So those are the people who can give blood to anyone, therefore their price of their blood to donate is much, much higher. And then all the way down, I believe it's AB negative is the lowest sort of rung because they are the universal receiver. They can receive any kind of blood and they're sort of seen as a drain on resources. And because I think it's like 3% of the population is AB negative, they're basically kind of the lowest of the low. Their blood fetches the lowest prices and they sort of live in these horrible slums. So one day, as I'm sure you can imagine, she makes a discovery and learns that things are not necessarily all that they seem. And not all that they seem is definitely the perfect way to describe this book because this has a twist that just smacked me straight in the face and I was completely caught off guard by it, and it was really cool and really, really fun. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was a good, fun read. I do think that the pacing was a little bit up and down, and I thought that maybe some of the characters could have been fleshed out a little bit better, but overall this was really, really fun. I would highly recommend it for anyone who's looking for something that's a little bit different, or if you're someone who's really into dystopian books. I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Then the Off the Grid Readathon hit in the month of October. It was our last one for this year. The next one will be in January. And I ended up reading 2 books. So you can check out my reading vlog for the Off the Grid Readathon. I'll link it up above. But I read The Turn of the Screw by Henry James and The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. So I obviously have a little bit of a theme if you're someone who's watching the Haunting of shows on Netflix because Bly Manor is based on The Turn of the Screw. So first, The Turn of the Screw. I thought this was fabulous. I really, really love this. I've never read anything by Henry James, and I feel like this has really ignited my interest in classics once again. So as I think I say in that vlog, I was an English major at university. I studied Victorian literature, which is kind of just before Henry James's time, I think. And basically I read so much that I just completely burnt out, and I've read very few classics since graduating 10 years ago, which is quite a long time. And I absolutely, I feel like this is just brought back what I love so much about classics for me. It's a story that's being told around the fire at Christmas Eve. Basically, we have this gathering of people telling ghost stories, and one man's like, I've got a really good one. So basically, he sends to London for basically this manuscript from this unnamed governess and her experiences at Bly Manor when she was younger. So basically, this young woman is hired on to care for 2 children, Flora and Miles. A lot of this may sound very familiar to you if you have seen The Haunting of Bly Manor. She's She's hired on to look after Flora and Miles in the countryside at this place called Bly Manor. Their uncle doesn't really have a lot of interest in raising them because he's sort of had these two children foisted upon him when their parents died. So she goes out to this place and everything seems to be fine and good until weird things begin to happen, especially figures of people who she finds out have passed away begin to appear. She sees them in the house peeking through windows, and she is absolutely convinced that these children are haunted, and they know they are being haunted and they want to be haunted, but she's the only one who's kind of acknowledging that this is happening. This is really fabulous. This is another is she mad or is there something supernatural going on kind of book, which I absolutely love if you know about my love of Laura Purcell, and I just thought it was so much fun. I had such a good time reading this, and I think part of the reason is because it just completely took me by surprise. I thought the ghosts would be like metaphors or something, or like, you know, something really sort of like, I don't know, a shadow in the window or something like that. No, they're full-on freaking ghosts walking around, and it's awesome. I really love this. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then for The Haunting of Hill House, I had basically binged the TV series with Scottish husband and my sister, and was very curious about the source material because I had never read any Shirley Jackson before, really, except for a couple of short stories, and they didn't really make a huge impression. So this was my first of her novels, and it's a funny one. I feel like it's a book that would have a lot of value for rereading. So basically in this we have a paranormal researcher who is going to this place called Hill House, which is reportedly super haunted, and he hires on these people to assist him. So these people who come with him, who have been invited to be assistants, have had some kind of paranormal experience in the past or have some kind of psychic manifestation. So we follow a girl named Eleanor, and she basically leaves her quite sad life behind, and she goes to Hill House for the summer, and very, very strange, creepy things begin to happen. I think that this is maybe less of a scary book like people would expect given sort of the TV show and sort of the fact that it's like one of the quintessential haunted house stories, but the moments of like horror in this are incredibly effective. So effective in fact that they lifted a lot of them for the show, and watching this woman be so incredibly impacted by this house was really, really fascinating. You see her sort of mood and her attitude towards the other people who are at the house really shift and evolve, and you can kind of see her declining. It's a really, really fascinating read. I have a feeling this is one that I'm going to start picking up at Halloween every year because I thought it was just really, really excellent, and again, it would be a really good one to reread because apparently you just pick up on new stuff every single time. I also gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars, so it was a very successful off-the-grid readathon. Then I actually had my biggest disappointment of the month. So I read The Way of All Flesh by Ambrose Parry. I read this with one of my real life friends. We have a little book club that we do together, which is really cute and lovely. And so we both read this because this was on both of our TBRs, and I was very unimpressed. I think she was quite unimpressed as well. So this is a funny one because this is constantly marketed as crime fiction. It's in the crime fiction section. The back of the book makes it sound like crime fiction. However, it's basically like maybe 20% crime at the end, and then it's like 10% heavy breathing in each other's faces, and then the rest of it is just following a very disappointing and mediocre man around historic Edinburgh. So this book takes place in Victorian Edinburgh, and it sort of focuses on the study of medicine. And Edinburgh was a huge centre for science and for medicine at this period in time, and it's a really fascinating period in time. It's one of the reasons I was really excited for this. So basically we follow a young man named Will Raven, and he is going to be an apprentice to this very famous and well-respected doctor. And we find out that he's maybe not necessarily who he says he is. He's kind of down down on his luck. He owes a lot of people money, and he's hoping that this is kind of his ticket to making some cash. So we have him, he moves into this house, and we also have this girl named Sarah, who is the maid in the house. And Sarah is, you know, just as intelligent and just as capable as any of these young men that this doctor is bringing in to study with him, but because she's a woman, she is unable to study medicine, which is something she really wants to do. So basically, the two of them discover that there are women around the city who are dying in mysterious ways, and they're going to investigate. So what I liked about this, because we should probably start there, I thought that they, the husband and wife duo who write this, did a really good job of bringing the city to life. As someone who loves Edinburgh, who lived in Edinburgh for a while and has a deep, deep, deep-rooted love of the city, it was really, really fun to read sort of the characters going around into all these different areas, and the new town and the old town and all of that. I thought that was really, really well done. And I think that the medical research that they focus on was really, really interesting. There's a particularly interesting thing that is invented, a very important invention in this book, and it's really fun to see that kind of come about. And that's pretty much it. I hated everything else about this. I really didn't like the fact that this is basically sold as crime fiction, and I don't think it qualifies because it's so little crime. And maybe like, it's maybe like, I don't know, this much crime. Probably actually a little bit more, I'm being mean. Maybe like, I don't know, whatever, like this much crime. And that was so incredibly disappointing, and the crime itself was really boring. You figure out really easily what's happening, who the perpetrator is, and how kind of the confrontation with the killer is going to come about. And it was just so incredibly predictable and dull, which I found really surprising because the husband is, I think, is it Christopher Brookmyre? Who's the husband? He's a really well-established crime writer. Yeah, Chris Brookmyre, who is someone who's written tons and tons and tons of crime. I thought that it was really surprising that the actual crime elements of this book were so, so poor. I also hated the characters. I thought that Will Raven was just a mediocre boy who we're just following around. He's not interesting. Even his kind of mysterious background and stuff isn't very interesting when things are revealed. And he's just really kind of snotty with no real redeeming features, which I thought was really disappointing. And Sarah, who's a character that I should on paper like, I feel the authors would have really benefited from reading some like 2010 YA, because she is a 2010 YA heroine. She's super bitchy about other women. She's so not like other girls. She's so smart and she's so capable, and everything she does is right and correct, and it's just, she was so boring. And I really, really grew to hate her so much. What's interesting is that the side characters in this book were quite interesting. I would have much rather have followed this doctor, Dr. Simpson, as he's making these discoveries, because he's a fabulous character. He's really interesting, and his sister, who's kind of on the verge of spinsterhood and desperately wants to get married, was a really interesting character as well. And I thought it was so strange that these secondary characters had so much more care put into their development than the main characters, who just sucked. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. I'm disappointed. So the next book that I have is an old NetGalley copy, and I've decided to make it a goal to be better about clearing out my NetGalley review copies, which are my digital ARCs. You'll see that in my November TBR. A lot of the books that I am bringing with me are books that I have from NetGalley. This one has been sitting around for a while. The second book is coming out soon, and one of my good friends was going to be reading it. So I decided to read it with them. So this is Master of Sorrows by Justin T. Call. So this was a completely unintentional buddy read. Me and Asha, who is a lovely, lovely book blogger who I'll link down below, and Judith from Dead Good Book Reviews ended up reading this together. It was a reread for them, and it was a first-time read for me. The second book, which I think is The Master Artificer, maybe, is coming out soon, so it was definitely a good time to catch up. So this is a funny one. I don't know if it's YA, and I don't know if it's adult. I don't really know where it sits, but I guess that just means that it's a really good crossover book. So this has a lot of very classic fantasy feeling. So if you're someone who really enjoys like the old school fantasy, this is definitely one to pick up. And it also feels like it has some kind of like D&D vibes to it as well, which is quite fun. So this book follows a character named Anav, and Anav is essentially a student at this magic school. But unlike many magic schools that you may be thinking of, what they actually teach you in this school is that magic is bad, and these students are being trained to essentially become thieves to steal magical artifacts to bring back to the school so they can be cataloged and put in a vault, because magic is bad in this world. We don't want people to have access to this sort of thing. So Anav is not only a student at this school, but he is also learning to be a deacon, but with the local priest, who has a very mysterious past. And this book is really fun. As I said, it has a lot of classic vibes. There's definitely some Farm Boy of Destiny elements to Anav and his character. We very much have a kind of wise older man who is sort of teaching him about magic and sort of acting as a fatherly figure to him. We have the definite evil, we have the good, and we have like, you know, magical orders, secret societies, things like that. It's just a really fun read. If you're looking for something that's a little bit lighter, don't be fooled by the size. It does look like a big chunky book, but it is a very fast read, and I would recommend the audiobook because it was really fun. I do sometimes struggle with teenage boy protagonists because they're teenage boy protagonists, but I thought Anav was very sweet, and although he is a little bit silly at times, I do think that he is a really nice character who has a lot of room to grow, and I'm very much looking forward to him sort of growing and evolving into a more mature person in later books. I liked him a lot more than I thought I would when I realized that this book had a teenage boy protagonist. It does have some romance, which is a really interesting part of the story. He's got some friends, which is always nice to see, and it's a really good fun read if you're looking for something that has the kind of comfort of classic fantasy. So my very last book is The Sin Eater by Megan Campisi. This is a really interesting one. I really struggle to describe this and to put this into words, so I hope you guys are following me, but this reads like historical fiction, but I guess technically it would be fantasy because the place that she's writing about isn't real, but it really feels like medieval historical fiction. So it's not historical fiction, but it is historical fiction? I don't really know. So in this book we follow a character named May, and May is an orphan. She is starving and she is arrested for stealing a loaf of bread at the age of 14. So instead of being hung along with the other girls who are caught and tried, she is sentenced to become a sin eater. Now what a sin eater is, and I think they might have really existed in real life, but I'm not 100% sure. But basically what a sin eater is they go to you when you are dying and you recite your sins to them, and each sin is assigned a certain type of food, and when you die the sin eater will consume all of those foods, take your sins upon themselves so you can go to heaven without any sin, and they'll kind of like bear the burdens of everyone's sins. So she's not thrilled about this new life. No one can look at her, no one can touch her, no one can speak to her. She's basically overnight become a shadow. So she finds the sort of local sin eater and sort of moves in with her, and she begins to sort of silently teach May her ways. So the two of them have to go to the castle to hear the sins of one of the queen's ladies in waiting, and they end up accidentally uncovering some kind of conspiracy. So May is determined to find out the truth and figure out what's going on. It's a really interesting book. This is what one of my former English professors would call a very earthy book. There's a lot of dirt and vomit and just grossness in this. It's a very earthy book. So if you're not cool with like bodily functions and stuff, maybe this wouldn't be one for you. But it's a really fascinating read because it's very much a sort of parallel to England and English history, and towards, you know, Christianity and stuff like that. So there are a lot of parallels to our real world, but again, this isn't a place that actually existed. It's a really fascinating and interesting read. I don't think we get very strong character work in this particular book. This is very much plot driven, but with a really sort of strong voice because it is told in the first person. So it's an interesting one. I don't think the characters are very well fleshed out, and it's hard to have a fleshed out character who can't speak or really interact with other people, but it's a really, really compulsive read. It's one that I really enjoyed. So if you're someone who enjoys historical fiction, especially kind of like 16th century set, this is definitely one to give a try. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So that is it for my October reading. I was a little bit thrown off in terms of the things that I wanted to read and the things that I wasn't able to read this month, but I still think that I had a really, really good month for reading. I found some things that I really enjoyed, and I got to clear off some things that maybe I didn't so much. I would love to hear in the comments below if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, if they're in your TBR, or if you read anything really good in the month of October. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.